Welcome to Mooney Reads, and welcome to a November-December wrap-up. So I didn't end the year with the largest reading months, but I still read some pretty cool books in the last bits of the year. I read 5 books in November and 3 books in December. You know, I worked on other ones, but we're just going to focus on what's finished. So starting out in November, we had Nonfiction November as kind of my main focus throughout that. November was also Suki's readathon. I clearly didn't write all of the things down that I needed to, but that was really cool to be a part of throughout the course of the month. It was kind of more than just reading. That was hosted by Jesse on YouTube. That was a readathon that they put together in honor of their mother who passed. And that was really meaningful for me, especially in the month of November. That tends to be my hardest month. And when I'm remembering the people that I lost. If you want to know more about that, you can check out their channel and their Instagram and all of that. And I read 3 nonfiction books, 2 fiction books. One of them was a library book. One of them was borrowed, kind of. It was a picture book that I read in store. So we'll start with that one. That's The Bakery Dragon, which was really cute. It was a dragon trying to figure out, like, what he wanted to hoard or how to make a hoard, and he ends up stumbling in a bakery, looking for gold, but finding, I think, like, bread. But then, like, I don't know, he basically shows these other dragons, and they end up creating a relationship with the people in the village instead of stealing their stuff. But it's very cute. The art is comfy, and I liked it. The next book that I read was Our Work is Everywhere, which is a library book that I borrowed. This is a graphic nonfiction. The author interviewed a number of different queer and trans people who do a variety of different types of work. So this is looking at work in a broader sort of way. So it's things from parenting to martial arts to just kind of surviving with a mental illness, sex work, lots of different things. I really liked the art, and I thought that it was a really interesting and expansive read. It was really cool to see just queer people living life so differently. I do think that the subtitle says that it's an oral history. I kind of take issue with that. Like, it's not, this is more like short vignettes than an oral history, really. So if you go in with that expectation, you know, I think that's better. But it was a really cool read overall. After that, I read Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White. And this is probably my favorite fiction book of 2024. I somehow have not read Andrew Joseph White, which is, I don't know how that happened, but I'm so glad that I read this one finally. And his other books will definitely be going, like, they were already ones that I wanted to read, but definitely priority TBR. This focuses on Miles, who, Miles's great-grandfather was key in a riot against a coal mining company. This is set in West Virginia. And for those who might not know, there's a huge history of major exploitation, especially by fossil fuel companies. And there's a really rich history of worker solidarity, dissent, and revolt against these living and working conditions. But Miles's great-grandfather was killed by the police because of his key role in this. And ever since then, his family and the policeman's family have been at odds. They've been killing each other. They've been maiming each other. It's a really vicious cycle. And Miles is, of course, brought into the fold. The story starts, and Miles is not quite out as trans to his family, but is sending them his letter sort of explaining this, and then going off to a party where he's going to talk to someone who has also been affected by that same police officer's family, because they have evidence that could help them actually form a case against them for the kind of violence that they've been experiencing. Things don't go exactly as planned, and so there's a lot of blood, possibly a ghost involved. This was so intense. I think I sat and read this in like a day. So this was really intense plot wise, and I'm not really much of a plot reader, but that was really good. I was also really interested in all the characters. There was a lot of nuance in kind of what they were dealing with. There's a lot of really cool discussion around neurodivergence, as well as physical disability, and disfigurement. At the beginning of the book, like, you know, like, just with the description, you know that Miles is autistic. Miles' whole family is probably autistic, but he doesn't use that language or really know that language, and that's one of the things that he kind of deals with throughout the course of the story. Just as well, he also sustains injuries, as you can literally tell from the cover of the book. And he's able to talk about that with someone else in the course of the story. I'll be vague here. But there are a lot of cool things regarding community in here. This also talks about a romantic identity, which is really not something that I see in a lot of books. So overall, this book is just really, really great. And I cannot wait to read more of his other stuff. After that, I read The Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, which I loved. It was, it tied for my favorite book the year my favorite nonfiction book the year that I read it. And in a lot of ways, this is a follow-up, especially a follow-up to the later chapters of it, where it's really critiquing capitalism and the sort of destructive nature of it. So this proposes we act in a way that is, of course, more consistent with nature. She uses the serviceberry, or I think it's also called the Juneberry. It has a lot of different names because it is a really prominent berry for a lot of cultures around where it grows, so it's been called a lot of different things. She proposes utilizing gift economy more. So basically giving what we have, and kind of going off of those sorts of systems rather than relying on capitalism. And that is really cool. I mean, there are so many really good quotes. I think she's able to synthesize these ideas really well and writes really beautifully. I do think that this has some limitations. I wish I had written better notes, because this is so small, so of course it could have been expanded and, you know, whatever. But really the main thing, like, she talks a lot about this gift economy and also the importance of having expansive ideas of what we can do, which harkens back to Imagination and Manifesto, which is one of my favorite books of the year. Because that whole thing is about how we need kind of this expansive, we need to have an idea of what we're going for that's outside of the white supremacist capitalist ideals that we're fed, right? But even, you know, saying some of that, she still brings in this gift economy working alongside capitalism. And, you know, I don't think that it's bad necessarily to point out that we can, you know, start doing this whenever, because that is kind of a good principle to, like, live by, to start going and changing things now. But I wish I could remember which section to really bring it up more, but I just thought that was kind of weird. Partly because the capitalist and gift economies are not complementary. They're like capitalism devours. The idea of giving something freely is like the antithesis of that, right? I don't know, it just seemed like an odd thing to emphasize it working alongside capitalism in such a small book. If we're focusing on like a big idea, it felt to me like bending a little, you know, to kind of the forces that this is supposed to go like directly up against. I don't know. Maybe I'm being weird or overly critical. Those are just some feelings that I had kind of towards the end of this. Overall, I really do like the ideas in this, and the writing is really pretty. I think that it's a really good kind of extension of Braiding Sweetgrass, which I loved. And the final book that I finished in November is No Study Without Struggle. And this book is one that I've been in the middle of for a really long time. I started reading it like in 2023. There were a lot of books that I was in the middle of in 2023 and like didn't finish. Some of it had to do with like it was hard. In April of 2023 my stepdad passed away, and a lot of the books that I was reading then I kind of just stopped. I didn't finish anything that month. But I've been trying to pick those books back up, and this one was excellent. It looks at the issue of settler colonialism in higher education, so in universities, and this breaks down what settler colonialism is and why it explains some of the issues in schools and universities better than just looking at racism, because of course there's racism in education. There's historical racism in who could be in the schools and things like that, but it goes far beyond that, and looks at issues, for instance, of land, and especially older universities that benefited from like some of the first projects taking land away from indigenous people, and then of course the subsequent not allowing them into receive this education, the education being exclusionary, of like teaching histories that erased indigenous people, and of course looking at the issue of money as well, and looking at how debt, how institutions benefit from debt and loans, and also the inequality within class and who has access to this education, who benefits from these systems more often. And this pulls in a lot of different examples, from looking at broader data on different schools to this author's experience as an educator and kind of some of the pushback that she received during students trying to protest, for instance. Also the issue of tenure. This also talks about DEI, so diversity, equity, inclusion, and critiques it, obviously, because it's like trying to put a band-aid on a bullet hole, more or less. Like, not only does DEI not solve the root problems, but it gives the illusion that they are being solved, because the solutions that are implemented like can never address those root problems. And most of these programs, you get the illusion that things are getting better, or the university is listening to certain people, but then if you look at like where the money is actually going, it's not really benefiting people in that sort of way. So she digs into that as well. So I think anyone who has been in, plans on being in, or is currently in higher education should definitely take a look at this. I do think that there are some maybe organizational things that could have been a little bit better, and It definitely reads like someone in academia wrote it. I also think that, especially towards the end, it would have been cool to see about more contemporary student organizing and things like that. This was published in 2020, I think. So, like, obviously very contemporary stuff would have been cool, but even for when it was published, I think there could have been more. It was published in 2021. And I don't think that it looks at the internet. Like, it doesn't, I think, acknowledge online movements, or talk about, like, online learning. I think that there is a lot more that could be said around some of those things a little bit more. But I think this is a really great start to the conversation, a really good primer on settler colonialism and how universities are implicated in that. So, very good. So, that is November. On to December. I read 3 books, or finished 3 books at any rate. 2 of the 3 were library books, and one of those 2 were audiobooks. So the first book that I have is a poetry collection. I've not read nearly enough poetry this year. I was looking, and I think I've read 3 poetry books. Only 3, which is wild. And it's something that should probably be rectified in 2025. But that is going to be Rifqua. And this was really excellent, very profound. Throughout these poems, the author talks about his experience as a displaced Palestinian and also brings in his grandmother, Rifqua, her experience as a displaced Palestinian who lived through the Nakba. This talks about the condition of Palestine, the experience of displacement, but it also incorporates certain aspects of, like, global solidarity, like looking at how Black Americans are connected in struggle with Palestinians in 1 or 2 of the poems. There are a lot of different kinds of poems in here. There are several short ones, a few that are a lot longer. There's one that's an erasure poem that I thought was really cool. He also uses, there's a word for this, but quotes at the beginning of some of the poems that kind of serve as a really cool backdrop. So people like Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, Frantz Fanon. So there are other literary elements. There's history. These are really beautifully constructed poems, really heartfelt and devastating, but a really great collection overall. After that, I listened to the audiobook of No Country for 8 Spotted Butterflies. This was a collection of essays and speeches that cover quite a few different topics. The author is indigenous to Guam and talks a lot about the political issues and climate issues, especially that directly impact Guam. And I found a lot of essays that covered that to be really, really impactful, really well done. So there was a lot that I really got out of this. That being said, there was some that was a little bit hit or miss. This is a very small book, which means that a lot of these essays and tidbits, like some of them are even like journal entries that are very fragmented, and some of those are cool, but some of these things left something to be desired. For instance, even I think a couple of the speeches, maybe, like, he took from the entry or the speech or whatever directly, and there was like minimal background and editing as far as I can tell, and I just really feel like some of these started in a place and could have been much better fleshed out, more or less. Or there were a couple that like started off at one spot and then like took a couple of turns and left me kind of confused at the end, because there were a lot of these where his thinking and perspectives are more like radical in kind of a good way, especially in the ones that he talks about climate and these different things. But then, as an example of one that I had kind of a hard time with, he talks about being a volunteer worker for Mother Teresa's, I can't remember if it was a school or a church off the top of my head, but he was a volunteer where they were helping children and things like that. And he talks about his experience and feeling that sometimes things were a little bit weird. And if you've heard of Mother Teresa's criticism, you know that things did get weird. And so he kind of talks about that, but then at the end, it like turns to, well, you know, even though these bad things happened, there were definitely really good moments. And kind of shares this anecdote of playing with kids and the nuns coming in and joining them too. So I thought that was just a really weird spot to end on. I think that he could have gone further out, you know, because I think that it could have circled back around. You know, I could see a way, you know, talking about how the good and the bad can exist at the same time, but still ultimately being able to critique it because of awful things are happening, you know, even with the guise of some of this good. You know, I think we could talk about that. But instead, it kind of ends on that anecdote, and I don't know, that was a little weird for me. And that's not the only one that was, like, a little bit weird, or, like, made a turn. Like, the way that he talks about Sherman Alexie early on, which, I mean, the way that he wrote, he expected criticism from it. So here we are. So, basically, very hit or miss in terms of the collection as a whole, but there are some really strong ones, and I'm glad that I read those. Like, overall, I'm really glad that I read the book, because there are some really strong pieces in it. It was just a little hit or miss. And I also think that this probably would have been enjoyed more by people who are already fans of the author. I was unfamiliar with him before this, so maybe if I read more of his other things, some of the things that he talks about in here would be more meaningful. And the final book that I finished in 2024 was Ties That Bind by Sarah Schulman. This is one that I started, I don't know, probably in October or something. I've been working through a lot of Sarah Schulman's works. In my last wrap up, I think I talked about 2 of her novels. I think I read 3 of her novels this year. I, a couple years ago, read Gentrification of the Mind, which I was obsessed with. And throughout the course of the year, I've read, kind of like familiarized myself with, and then read up to, I think, past the halfway point of Let the Record Show. I actually think I have it right here. Yeah. I'm almost done with her. I need to just finish it. It's awesome. This book kicks ass. But the one that I finished, Ties That Bind. This was published in 2009. And it's talking about familial homophobia. She talks about how there is obvious homophobia, direct, nasty things that people can say and do to gay members of their family. But there's also the family members who sit around and don't do anything. And that is an integral piece to how homophobia, particularly within the realm of the family, is able to really flourish. And also she talks about how familial homophobia, that's where a lot of it starts. The family as a system within society serves to, you know, lay the foundations for a lot of ideas, but also a lot of things like homophobia and racism and so forth. So she's talking, you know, she talks about why we need to specifically focus on the family. And I think now, like, that's a pretty common thing and kind of an obvious thing. But at the time, You know, this is 2009. There certainly isn't the same amount of discourse kind of in this regard. So she hits on a lot of different things throughout this. She talks about therapy specifically and how that is limited in terms of how it addresses familial homophobia, and she looks at her own experience in particular, going to therapy with her homophobic family members and having even gay and lesbian therapists not say anything when her family member says something homophobic, and then later will tell her, I'm sorry that happened, when they could have said something in the moment and then decided not to. So she's basically talking about the inadequacies of that. She also looks at kind of like inter-community turmoil, specifically talking to a lawyer who has dealt with custody battles between lesbians and why people choose to try to take away their kids like that, and how that kind of hurt and expression of power like functions, and how the root of some of that is familial homophobia. And a big key in a lot of this, from looking at how familial homophobia functions to this kind of inter-community homophobia, a big part of this is that people don't speak out. So the importance of the third party in being able to mitigate some of that, and not having these behaviors normalized, more or less. It's actually kind of cool because you can see, I think, some of what will end up being Conflict is Not Abuse in here. I've not read Conflict is Not Abuse. I have started it. I listened to the intro and it was like really good, so I decided that I needed my own copy to read and write notes on. I've yet to do that, but it will happen. So that was neat. I definitely do have some criticisms. This is obviously written in 2009, and what I mean by that, you know, isn't just like the fact that it's literally dealing with like the legal landscape of 2009, but in some of the solutions. Because, for instance, in the therapy chapter, she mentions like the possibility of using like the legal system to mandate therapy for homophobes in certain instances, and then some of what she says on the chapter on gay marriage. It's like you are assuming that the state can do a lot that it historically has been really bad at doing. So like, in that way, there's definitely criticism with the book, but I think that kind of shows just like where some kind of ideas kind of were around this time, because I think that's kind of par for the course with some other things for that time. And I think a lot of the criticism I have is some that I would imagine the author probably would respond to anyways or agree with. So it was really cool to see kind of where ideas around this were. So it's like cool as a more of a historical document and insight. I also think a lot of this could have been stronger if she had pulled from research too. That being said, I don't know how available or existent the research was at that point, because this kind of like idea of familial homophobia and like some of the stuff that she's talking about in here, I don't think that there probably were very many, if any, studies on this looking at gay people's experience in therapy or anything like that. So I think that the framework of what she put out just would have been a lot stronger if there had been more like sources available. That being said, I do think that there were probably people talking about it before, and it would have been cool to see her respond to some of that in here, rather than it mostly being kind of her thoughts and experiences. But regardless, it was an interesting book. Not her best, but I'm glad that I read it. It was a cool thing to have read. Sorry for the noise. Hopefully it's not too loud. It's playtime in Kittyland. So that's my cat playing with her little ball toy. But that is it for what I read in November and December. If you've read any of these, let me know about it. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching. Bye.